There's a hole in the bucket. Pictures by Nadine Bernard Westcott. There's a hole in the bucket. Henry! Water! There's a hole in the bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in the bucket. Dear Liza, a hole. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. With what shall I fix it, dear Eliza, dear Eliza? With what shall I fix it, dear Eliza? With what? With a straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, with a straw. But the straw is too long, dear Eliza, dear Eliza. But the straw is too long, dear Eliza, too long. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it. Well, how shall I cut it, dear Eliza, dear Eliza? Well, how shall I cut it, dear Eliza? Well, how? With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With an axe, dear Henry, dear Henry. With an axe. But the axe is too dull, dear Eliza, dear Eliza. But the axe is too dull, dear Eliza, too dull. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it. On what shall I sharpen it, dear Eliza, dear Eliza? On what shall I sharpen it, dear Eliza? On what? On a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. On a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry. On a stone. But the stone is too dry, dear Eliza, dear Eliza. But the stone is too dry, dear Eliza, too dry. Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wet it. With what shall I wet it, dear Eliza, dear Eliza? With what shall I wet it, dear Eliza? With what? With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water. Well, how shall I carry it, dear Eliza, dear Eliza? Well, how shall I carry it, dear Eliza? Well, how? In a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. In a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry. In a bucket. Uh-oh. But there's a hole in the bucket, dear Eliza, dear Eliza. There's a hole in the bucket, dear Eliza, a hole. Have a good day, guys.